What is up, boys and girls? It's Seb here with Modify Up. It's been a hot minute since I posted up anything new, so today I want to get back in the swing of things and kick things off with the first of many 1.5 AZ videos. Now, there actually really isn't that much information on the difference between 1AZ and 2AZ motors, so for this video I want to get through the teardown of both of these, and once they're both stripped down and cleaned up, we can go through the differences and see exactly what's going to work, what's not going to work. So, grab a big ass drink because this is going to be a long one. Before we go in too hard, I want to explain my reasonings for going down this route. Why not build a 4AGE or a beams or something else? First of all, I wanted to choose something that was a little different, but was also cheap and easy to source parts for. It had to be Toyota, and it had to be something that wasn't so played out that you could buy every single conversion part off the shelf. You know, like a beams motor. Now, after spending countless nights poring over pros and cons lists, I narrowed it down to the ZZ series engine or the AZ series engine. Both have their pros and cons, but the deciding factors really came down to 2 points. 1. The ZZ motor has no provisions on the block for mounting brackets. Thus, an engine plate must be used with extensive fabrication to the chassis to even get the thing sitting in the engine bay. And 2. The AZ engines are increasingly more common and can be purchased for a ridiculously cheap price. Having said that, dropping a stock 2AZ into an AE86 would produce a pretty lackluster result. Although torquey with its 2.4 litre displacement, the engine is weak and lazy with a 6,500 RPM redline. These engines were designed to be lightweight and economical, and not performance orientated by any stretch of the imagination, as designated by the F in 2AZ FE. The F denotes a narrow valve angle cylinder head, which is associated to economy or efficiency, as opposed to the G in 2ZZGE, denoting a wide valve angle cylinder head, which is associated to performance at the expense of economy. Those letters do not denote whether the camshafts are driven independently or share a common drive, as some people will tell you. The narrow valve angle head is super clear with the physical height of the head required to really stand those valves up at an angle of 27.5 degrees from vertical. One thing I'm a little sad about is that the ZZ engine has VVT LI, which is both variable valve timing and dual profile camshafts, much like Honda's VTEC, which the AZ engine doesn't have. Instead, we have to make do with a single VVT on the intake cam only. So, with the 2AZ weighing in lighter than a 4AG, it's time to start pulling these two down and see if this Franken motor will even work. To date, I'm only aware of 3 other 2AZ converted Hutchies. Starting with the embodiment of AE86 drifting in the USA, Taka Aono's Hasselgren built Flying 86 for Formula D. Yes, that's the Formula Atlantic Hasselgren. You know, the Hasselgren that won TRD Engine Builder of the Year for 8 consecutive years in a row. Then we have Stavros Grillis with his 700 horsepower AZ86 all the way over in Greece. This thing is super cool and has many parts adapted from an SR20 engine. And last that I can find is Australia's own Little Red Spirit with his all-motor 2AZ AE86 built by Matthew Jones using mainly adapted OEM parts. Each of these builds, to my knowledge, have retained the standard stroke. If there are any others I've missed, first of all, sorry, and please show me more. I'd love to geek out over other people's creations. So let's start the teardown on both of these engines. And once we have them totally disassembled and cleaned, we'll go through in detail the exact differences between the 1AZ and 2AZ engines. Let's get the valve covers off and have a look at the health of what's going on inside. Things are fairly simple here, with a long baffling system in the valve covers here with no lubrication rails and nothing special to see. Once the valve covers were off, I began stripping the front of the motor by removing the accessory drive belt tensioner pulley assembly, the water pump pulley, and the harmonic balancer pulley. Sometimes a balancer can be a real pain to get off, so a puller much like the one I'm using here can save you a lot of heartache. This was too tight to slide off by hand, but not tight enough that I needed to lock the crank. I did the same on the 1AZ, and although I set up the pulley, it essentially slid off by hand. Now we can flip the motors and remove the lower sumps, where we'll see our first real sign of any major difference in the rotating assemblies. I'm going super slow on this first flip with the valve covers off because I'm not too sure how much fluid is retained in the block even after the drains are removed. Generally there'll always be water or oil trapped somewhere, so it's best to take care, otherwise you'll be mopping up. Ask me how I know. The tin sumps are identical and as usual are held in with a series of 10mm bolts. We'll be modifying these sumps for extra capacity and adding either a swirl pot around the pickup or some swinging trapdoors. But for now, we can just pull them off and see what the condition of the oil is in. This will give us an indication of how they were treated before we pull the engines out. Once the bolts are out, a little pry bar and some gentle love taps are used to break the seal, and we can see the 2AZ pan is fairly clean with very minimal deposits in the pan. The 1AZ on the other hand is a classic example of what happens when oil mixes with water. This is pretty nasty, but pretty much what I expected. Under normal circumstances, anytime you work on any part of the rotating assembly, you would spin the motors up to top dead center on compression stroke. But the 1AZ motor is totally seized, which I'm hoping is from a rusty borer as a result of a blown head gasket. So I'll leave both these engines where they lie and I'll show you how to time everything up on assembly. Getting the timing around of the 2AZ is a little bit more involved because of the two balance shafts that need to be timed together. But since we're using the 1AZ crankshaft, we'll be totally deleting the balance shafts altogether. So a quick flip back up, we'll see any remaining oil in the crankcase drip on your floor. We can start on the timing case now. Again, nothing special here other than it's a massive one piece all the way up to the valve cover. This is where one of the engine mounts bolts up in front wheel drive or four wheel drive configuration. So the timing cover is super strong. We just pop out the timing chain tensioner, the bolts and a bit of pry bar and we're off. There's no tricks here, no gaskets either. There are very few gaskets on this engine. Everything mostly is either silicone or rubber O-rings. Now that both timing covers are off, we can take a look at the timing chain assemblies on both motors. You can see that this is a typical timing chain setup with a single fixed guide on the exhaust side and a tensioning guide on the intake side. Note that there's no guide in between the cams like an SR20 setup. And also the physical size of the chain is super small. Obviously a weight and drag saving measure by Toyota. I'll go ahead and crack the cam sprocket bolts here while I still have the timing chain on, because removing these bolts can be a pain once the chain is removed. To remove the timing chain, the trigger wheel for the crank needs to slide off. Then we can quite simply unbolt the guides and slip the timing chains off, since our tensioner came out with the timing covers. Like most OEM chains, there are colored links in the chain that will line up with the timing marks on the crank sprocket and the cam sprockets for easy assembly. I'm being careful with the chain here as I pull it off, because usually the cams will want to spin around as the cam loads are under tension from the valve springs. Once the timing chains are off, we can start pulling the cams out so we can access the cylinder head bolts. Now, here is the correct sequence for removing the camshaft caps. It's important to follow this procedure if you don't have a strong grasp of engine mechanicals, as tightening or removing the cam caps in the wrong order can result in actually snapping a camshaft. But if that's not your style or you don't have access to a workshop manual, you can look at a camshaft and see which lobes are acting on the buckets and pushing the valves open. This is where the tension will be on the camshaft, so providing you loosen these bolts last, you'll minimize the risk of damaging your cams and your cylinder head. Usually you can remove all the cam caps that have no force acting on the lobes, then remove the last cap that has a force acting on the lobe. This will ensure that there's no bending pressure on the cam itself, and you won't be left with a two-piece camshaft. Once the cam caps are off, lay everything out in order on the bench. Just use a magnet here to pull out all the buckets. And once these are cleaned up, they'll all be numbered and stored away, as each bucket is actually a different thickness. The 2AZ is a solid head valve train arrangement, where the cam lobes act directly on the solid buckets, which then act onto the valve itself. No rocker arms, no hydraulic lifters, so provided we have valve springs that are up to the task, there's very minimal chance for any valve float at high RPM. Since we're shooting for a 10,000 RPM rev limit, this is a good thing. There really isn't any reason to have such a high red line, other than it suits my driving style, and there's no point having an AE86 that doesn't rev its lips off. I'd rather build it to handle my shitty driving than to have to change my driving and be frustrated with the car's performance. Will it make power up that high? Not sure yet. But I try everything I can to have a usable mid-range and top end so it's not an undrivable lag monster. So now we have the cams and buckets out, we can take a look at the head bolts, cam bearing and VVT solenoid. The AZ motors are prone to overheating and pulling head bolt threads out of the block. Once this happens, there's no clamp load on the head gasket, which allows coolant to enter the combustion chamber. Just like any other head gasket failure, if the engine gets too hot, the head can warp. The pistons can grab the bore and the block can crack. It's just a snowball effect, the longer it's left. I'm sure this is what happened to the 1AZ motor, as we're totally locked up with no metal shavings found in the oil at all. So, after seeing how much water was in the crankcase, we can be sure that water has got into the cylinders and rusted out the bores. But let's go ahead and check it out. One thing to remember is to clean out the head bolts before you try and crack them loose. They're a triple square Allen head, meaning that they have 12 points. So one wrong move and you can round these out super easy. So just make sure you clean the heads out so you can get the tool in square and bottomed all the way out. I'll start here by loosening each bolt off 90 degrees in an outward spiral pattern. The workshop manual specifies this in reverse, starting from the outside corner spiraling in, but always follow a spiral pattern as a rule of thumb. The main point here is to evenly release pressure so as not to warp the cylinder head. Once the 90 degrees is cracked, I go around and do another 90 degrees, then it's ready for the gun. Don't forget to pull that VVT solenoid out so you can get that front head bolt out too. And just like that, we have the head off. So we can have a quick look around, then jump on the 1AZ and do the same process. Without diving too deep into diagnostics, you can see when you have a sealing issue, once you have the head off, if it's a blown head gasket, usually the coolant entering the combustion chamber will clean away all the carbon deposits in that cylinder. So if you have one or two really clean piston heads, it's a dead giveaway that something hasn't been sealing right. This could be from a failed gasket, eroded metal around a water jacket, a crack in the block, or even a crack in the head. All of these things need to be looked at once everything is disassembled and cleaned down. In this case, the 1AZ looks like cylinder 3 has filled up with water the worst, but all cylinders here have signs of water entry. Looking at this, the head wall tension was fine with all head bolts and there was no signs of head gasket failure. So once this is cleaned up, we'll have to visually inspect for cracks. So now we have the heads off, we can flip over again and take a look into the crankcase area and see a major difference between the 1AZ and 2AZ motors. The 2AZ has two counter-rotating balance shafts to reduce the NVH levels created by the engine. These in fact are not timed with the crank and serve no purpose to balance a crankshaft, as the crank is already fully balanced with its 8 counterweights. Once we get the cap off, you'll see that the gears for these shafts are actually made of alloy and plastic resin. The 1AZ is a much simpler design, with this area simply used as a windage tray to separate the spinning crank from the sitting oil. Now we remove the oil pump. This is driven off a separate sprocket on the crank by a dedicated chain. I'll have to do some research here on the failure rates, flow rates and pressure ratings so we can best decide on what to do with the oiling system for high RPM. The oil pump timing chain is tensioned by a spring only and is a cute little baby guide that's held in with one bolt. Just like the cam, we'll buzz off the bolt from the sprocket before we pull the chain off. Then the whole pump is held in with 3 bolts. Once the oil pumps are off, it's time to remove the upper oil sump. This midsection piece is really important as it serves as a windage tray and a lower block skirt to help with the rigidity of the whole crankcase. It'd be really nice to be able to somehow tie this section into the main caps for the crank, but again, this engine was never designed with strength in mind. So the mid sump is held in with a series of 12mm bolts, and don't get tricked like I did, but there's actually a secret squirrel bolt hiding under the oil filter thread. That's a big ass 12mm Allen head, so once you have that out, you can get to the last bolt. A bit of pry bar and the whole thing will come off. Once the mid-sub was off the 1AZ, it actually looked okay. No metal shavings and was clean enough for the amount of Ks. Onto the 2AZ with the balance shafts. Here you can see the difference in the oil filter area with this heat exchanger. Here, oil and water run through two different passages where the two fluids average out their temperatures. So on startup, the coolant comes up to temp faster so it warms the oil. When it's up to operating temperature, the engine oil runs hotter than the coolant, so the coolant will draw heat away from the oil. Science, right? This isn't necessarily a 1AZ, 2AZ difference. It may be a auto manual thing or a difference in series. Anyway, there's a secret bolt under there anyway, so it comes off. And the same with the oil pump. Now we can remove the balance shaft housing held on with 8 bolts. So you see the middle gear is actually a plastic resin, which was used to keep things nice and quiet, but this is also quite fragile. We'll be using the whole mid sump from the 1AZ, so we can totally delete the balance shafts. And just like the 1AZ, a few bolts and some pry bar, and we can expose the rotating assembly. Here you can see the ring gear that's pressed onto the third counterweight for the balance shaft. Since we'll be removing this stuff, I'll weigh up all the parts and see how much of a weight saving we can get from this. With the workbench getting cramped and my OCD going off the walls, it was time for a quick cleanup and stock take of all of our fasteners before we pull out the rods, piston and crank. I always bag my fasteners in groups of where they came out into labeled snap lock bags. Starting with the 2AZ, we start by loosening the rod bolts 90 degrees. Then another 90, and then it's ready for the gun. I like to loosen the rod bolts all the way to the end, then thread them back on 2 threads. Then I push down on the bolts to move the piston up towards the deck. This will give you a good idea of how much resistance there is in the bore. If the rings, pistons or bore are clapped out, the piston could actually drop straight out of the engine. These are pretty tight, so I can remove the caps all the way and use the handle of my hammer to gently push out the pistons and rods, taking care not to damage the crank or bores. Lay your pistons out in order on the bench, taking note of which way faces the front of the engine. There are locating dowels on the rods, so the caps can only go on one way, and the rods have small indicators on them telling you which side faces the front. Now these rods are puny, like Kevin Hart puny, so there's really no use for these at all. Even in standard naturally aspirated form, these are too small to handle any sort of high RPM, let alone adding boost into the equation. So these can go in the bin. Once all the rods are out, I always like to spin the crank by hand to get a feel for how tight the clearances are from factory. Note that the crank center is actually offset from the center of the block. This is yet another technique used by Toyota to reduce drag on the whole rotating assembly. Now we can start on the main caps. These are all numbered and have arrows on them pointing to the front of the engine. If for some reason they aren't on there, and this goes for any engine, make sure you engrave these onto the caps because you cannot mix these around. They are precisely machined to be in the exact position they were machined in. And if you mix this up, there's a good possibility that the crank won't spin. Again, we hit these in the same spiral pattern with 90 degrees, then 90 degrees again, and then we hit them with the gun. Because the caps are so precisely machined and doweled, they can be difficult to get off, so try wiggle them free by hand. If they still won't move, you can use pliers on the plain sides of the caps to wiggle them free. Do not ever use a hammer to get the caps off. Once the main caps are off, we can set the crank free. Off you go, buddy. Your work is done here. Now we'll do the same to the 1AZ, and at the end of this, we have both rotating assemblies laid out for inspection. If If you made it this far, congratulations. We need to clean down absolutely everything now, and then we can start taking measurements. Here's a sneak peek of what it looks like when it's all cleaned down. That is it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video of me disassembling these two motors. Make sure you tune in next week where we'll do some side-by-side comparisons and we'll take some real-world measurements to see what's going to be compatible between these two engines. I just want to thank each and every one of you for watching, and if you like what you see today, make sure you drop me a like or consider subscribing. Okay, bye!